Hi everyone, thank you for joining the second of this year's Green Futures webinars. My name is Kath Crowther. I'm the Regional Director for the CLA in the East and your chair for today. A quick reminder that you can claim BASIS and Neuroso points for today's event. I'll give you details on how to claim those at the end of the session. Today we're joined by Jonathan Baker, who will be giving an overview of the agricultural transition and the changes ahead as we move away from direct payments, and will give an overview of ELMS. Sam Dovey will then drill down into the Sustainable Farming Incentive, SFI, early rollout, which we will see later this year. And finally, Richard Barnes will talk about local nature recovery strategies and how these will be important in targeting and prioritising funding under biodiversity net gain, ELMS, other income streams, and we'll give some details of the local nature recovery part of ELMS, as well as a bit on landscape recovery. We'll then have plenty of time for questions at the end for a panel discussion before we finish at around 2:15. Please do feel free to ask questions at any time during the presentations. Please use the Q&A button. If you move on to the next slide, please. You can see the Q&A button at the bottom of your toolbar on the bottom of your screen. Please ensure that you use this Q&A button, not the chat function, because we won't be able to see your questions in there. It would be helpful if you could say who you're addressing your question to. I should also remind you that today's webinar is being recorded and will be available to those who have registered after the event. I'll now pass over to Jonathan. Thank you.
Hey everybody, good afternoon, a pleasure to be here, and thanks Kath and CLA colleagues. So yes, as Kath said, my name is Jonathan Baker. So I'm one of the deputy directors in the bit of Defra who are reforming agricultural policy. So specifically, my team and I are responsible for our overall policy plans across the agricultural transition, and also responsible for making sure we're talking to and learning from the right people as we move through the transition and roll out these reforms. And I'm also a former CLA staffer, so it's always a pleasure to be here talking to the membership. Next slide, please, Tina. So I'm going to set out a bit of a reminder around the agricultural transition, which I won't overlabour, but just talking through, and then we've got Sam and Richard who'll talk through some of our more recent announcements around SFI, local nature recovery and landscape recovery. So, but it is worth just kind of reflecting on where we are around the wider transition. So the agricultural transition period is a period which started last year, and this is a 7-year period over which we're moving away from direct payments. It's an important concept because it's legislated for in the Agriculture Act, and it's something which we have committed to, and we are currently in the kind of second year or the end of the first financial year of the agricultural transition. The big shift here is around moving away from direct payments, but keeping the same money and operating through new priorities. And one of the things that will change significantly for the transition is a much more greater focus on outcomes that we had within the Common Agricultural Policy, and in particular, but not exclusively, environmental outcomes, as alongside creating a subsidy-free and sustainable farming sector. And you can see some of the outcomes which are articulated here, and that's what we have a series of policy and kind of schemes live to kind of put into place. Next slide, please, Tim. So we talk a lot about money, and that's my job, managing the £2.4 billion a year that's available for farmers in England that we are repurposing. But the agricultural transition is not just about that. It's about a different look and feel from a farming and landowner perspective. So less top-down rule setting, less of the needless bureaucracy that we had around previous payment schemes and previous regulation, and less strict and unbending enforcement. And instead, it's much more around collaborative design. How can we work together? Flexible, outcome-oriented, by which I mean bending and adapting where we know it's going to help us achieve good outcomes. Something which is quite a big change, I think we're now just people are realising, is around more frequent and useful change. So the rules will not be fixed as they were within the Common Agricultural Policy for 7 years. We get it wrong for 2.5, just about get our act together towards the end of that. And just as things are running, we then completely change everything again. We'll be much more iterating and rolling our changes out in a structured way where we might see regular changes, but that's changes for the better and in response to direct user and farmer feedback. we can talk about some of those perhaps through the panel. And across the whole of the piece, really focusing on outcomes. And the reason why we're making these changes is because it needs to look and feel better for farmers, but also Secretary of State at the CLA conference in November made very clear his views around direct payments and the need for reform and to remove those. And I'm sure we're all very aware of farmers' unique positions in terms of improving natural environment, animal health and welfare, and contributing to net zero. So we're looking to make these reforms to move away from those previous policies and instead get us much more in a position where we're supporting farmers to kind of make the most of their unique position to address some of the big challenges we're facing across the coming years. Next slide, please. So what's happening and kind of when is it happening? And I talked about how things iterate and adapt over time. So it's already happened. We've got over 70 tests and trials. We've got over 900 odd farmers in SF with live SFI pilot agreements. And that will continue to adapt across coming years. This year will be, oh, sorry, next look back, please. This year we'll be rolling out the early rollout of sustainable farming incentive as we start small and kind of build the scheme out over time. And local nature recovery will be starting to do a very targeted rollout towards the end of this year before we then roll that scheme out further. And landscape recovery, the third of those offers will be available from imminently. We'll be starting the project development phase. Yes, so now looking at direct payments, I said that this is happening already. So many of you will have experienced the first reductions in direct payments, which are set out on the left-hand side column here. So the first year, the kind of larger reductions were made on larger farmers on the basis that the kind of those with broader shoulders can make those larger reductions. That it was really important that all farmers see a reduction in that first year and understand that direct payments are going to be gone by 2027. That'll be their last year of payments. So that's happening. And alongside these reductions to direct payments, we're really simplifying the system, making it really easy to adapt and respond, to apply for rather. And from 2024, we'll completely de-link direct payments from the land so that farmers have maximum flexibility about what they do in their business, rather than feeling the need to continue managing their land in a way which allows them to access subsidy. We want farmers making business-oriented decisions rather than subsidy-oriented decisions as soon as possible. Next slide, please. Okay, so focusing on the subject of the conversation today around environmental land management. So we talk about three schemes and we're piloting those. It's really worth noting that in our head, we, particularly Secretary of State, talk about this as being a kind of series, like a single service, so that a farmer or land manager can come and can think, what do they want to do on their land, and can seamlessly move across these three schemes in a way which works best for them, rather than before we had quite static, quite rigid, hard defined boundaries between HLS and different schemes. We're trying to address that so it feels much more for farmers like a series of opportunities. At a high level, these three schemes, the way I think about them is in the kind of three questions, which one is the answer? So sustainable farming incentive is a scheme that sustainable farming incentive is the answer to the question of, do we want most or all farmers to do it? Is it relatively simple to implement without needing extensive advice? And can it be done in the same way everywhere? If the answer to the outcome we're trying to achieve is yes, then that's just sustainable farming incentive. Local nature recovery is the answer to, so do we need to be done only in the right places? Is the action more likely to need advice to get right? And does it require making space for nature? If the answer is yes, that's much more about local nature recovery. And then landscape recovery is, do we need to do it? We're looking for it to have action at a large scale, but will it require long-term land use change? And is it best achieved through collaboration or partnership? And you can see a bit more detail here on the slide about those three schemes. And before we move on to some of the detail around sustainable farming incentive, it's worth noting we've said that we're looking for an even split across those schemes by 2028. That's very much a working assumption. Coming back to the point I made earlier, we're making sure we're achieving outcomes through our reforms. So we'll continue to keep that review under that split of funding across the three schemes under review as we move through the transition and as we see what targets we need to be achieving through these reforms. Next slide, please. Okay, so we'll passing over to Sam. So Sam Davey is part of our Sustainable Farming Incentive team, and we'll talk you through the kind of next level of detail around SFI, and particularly the early rollout of SFI. So Sam, over to you.
Thanks, Jonathan, and afternoon, everybody. Good to be here to be able to go through this with you. If could we go back one slide, possibly? Brilliant. Yeah. So thank you. So as Jonathan was saying, that we've got the sustainable farming incentive. This is the sort of first of our three schemes, and the one that is particularly sort of aimed at farming and universal sort of practices, and one that we want to empower farmers to be able to do themselves, to be able to apply for it, to be able to do the actions, to be able to receive the outcomes and receive the payments all themselves. And as you may have picked up in the sort of timeline slide that we had, that Jonathan went through a couple of slides back, if any of you are familiar with that, and from our sort of previous assumptions, that you'll see that we've actually moved our sort of launch of the sustainable farming incentive. We brought it forward a couple of years. So although we're piloting it, and we're piloting a wider set of standards, we felt that actually it's time to the time is right to get things going, to get the scheme out there. And so when we're going to launch it later this year, and when we launch it later this year, it's going to be for farmers who are currently eligible for basic payment scheme, BPS. So there are a number of reasons that we've taken that eligibility at the moment, some sort of practical and administrative reasons, and also so that we can get things going at scale, but you know, to a sort of a group that are known. But it will be our intention to sort of widen this up as things go on. Initially, the sustainable farming incentive will be a 3-year agreement. So again, different to sort of the annual BPS type things, but more flexible than some of the existing agri-environment schemes that are out there at the moment. And we're saying that that those that apply for the scheme will need to have management control of the land for the duration of that agreement, so that we can be certain that they can carry out the actions that we need to achieve the environmental outcomes. And you know, as farming goes on, you know, throughout the year, and there are different things to do at different times, it's not always necessarily fits neatly into a calendar year. And as the scheme will build, then we'll get to see more results come through, which is why we've initially gone with this 3-year agreement. Common land and tenanted land, so are both subjects that are relatively complex, and we could probably spend a whole session on each of those as well. But just to say that common land and tenanted land would definitely be eligible for the scheme when we launch later this year. And there are there are various caveats, and we're working through different solutions for those. But with the principle of being able to have management control and undertake the actions, then we want as much land in as possible. Because it's new, and it's new for us, and it's going to be new for our farmers as well, we're going to initially, certainly it's not going to be a sort of a whole farm scheme, so farmers can choose how many of the fields that they want to put into each of the standards, so they don't have to enter the whole farm. And we want to do this because we want to we want to sort of build confidence. We don't want to think it's an all or nothing thing, and it's better to sort of build incrementally, and rather than sort of the all or nothing approach. And I think we're currently sort of saying that all of a field or a land parcel must be entered in, but you can decide, or the farmers can decide which land parcels to put in existing in the initial scheme. Land in existing agri-environment schemes, so countryside stewardship or any mid-tier or higher level schemes, can also enter into the scheme, as long as we're not sort of paying for the same things twice from the standards and within existing agreements, or where actions could be contradictory to the sorts of things that they're already doing. And at this stage, we are saying that land must be fully sort of in England, and cross-border land parcels won't be eligible for the scheme in 2022. So again, going back to sort of the sort of non-whole farm approach at this early stage, that doesn't mean to say that if you've got land in a cross-border region that means you can't enter SFI. It would just be those land parcels that are on a cross-border basis. So that cross into our devolved nations, those particular parcels wouldn't be eligible. And finally, just around the application window, when we open the application window later this year, we're sort of planning on a 10-week application window to give people plenty of time to have a look and to consider it and think about it and to apply. And we're also saying that we're going to ensure that we sort of minimise disruption with our sort of 15th of May sort of date for BPS and other sort of schemes. So we're looking to make sure that people have time and an opportunity to consider the scheme before they enter, and so with a view to having it running this year and making payments this year. So that's about eligibility. If I could have the next slide, please. So agreements. So as I mentioned just now, that the agreements are going to be for 3 years, and what our current sort of thought with this is that we're going to allow amendments to agreements at 12 monthly points from the start date, so sort of on the anniversary of the start date. This will be, if we could just go back one, thank you. This will be really on a positive basis. So if a farmer sort of entered a certain level of one of the standards and wants to add in additional standards as they come online, or increase the level of ambition within the standard because they feel that that they've gone in, say, at the introductory level and feel very comfortable with doing that and feel that they could move on, or indeed if more land was available to come in, maybe more land had come into the farming business or come out of an agreement, or just generally feel more comfortable with having more land in. So at the sort of 12-month point, there will be an opportunity to change, but our current plan is that it will be a change on a positive basis. I think we would all accept that in any 3-year period there could be reason to have to sort of reduce the sort of land or the level of ambition within the agreement, but we would hope that would only really be in exceptional circumstances or circumstances beyond their control. So we're looking to have a positive amendment type basis. If I could have the next slide, please. So how will this work with countryside stewardship? So one of the really sort of complex areas we've been working through over the last number of months and even years is how during the transition we sort of build and develop our new schemes and implement those and launch them alongside the existing schemes, because we don't want to obviously lose all the good work that's being done, and we want those schemes to continue. Sorry, is it possible just to go back? I think it's got a slight mind of its own today. Is it okay to go back to the previous slide? So if not, I'll carry on. Thank you. So our current plan for SFI when we launch it later this year is that that land can be in both schemes. So as I mentioned before, as long as the standards and the actions within the standards of the sustainable farming incentive are not contradictory to any options that you may have in existing countryside stewardship agreements or give rise to a double payment. And again, that's another area that we're going to be providing some more information on so people can make informed decisions. Then land can be both in countryside stewardship and SFI. And we'll be working how that works in the future as we bring in more standards into the scheme and more land, hopefully more land into the scheme as well. But we want to make it as flexible as we can, because it really is about what works best for the farmers and how we can move through this transition period together. Next slide, please. And this brings me on to the sort of roadmap and thinking for the future. So obviously, when we launch the scheme later this year, we're going to start with there's two main farming-based standards: the arable and horticultural soil standard and the improved grassland soil standard. In addition, we're including a moorland and rough grazing introductory standard for land that's mapped above the moorland line, and there's an annual health and welfare review, which I'll give you a bit more detail on in a moment. So that's our offer for 2022. And then, as you can see in this slide, that really is just the start. So that's the start of the scheme, the first standards that we're bringing in. And then over the coming years, up to 2025, we'll be adding in more standards into the live service. So as we work and test and pilot and develop these additional standards, we'll bring them into the live service so people can add them into their agreements or add land that would fit with some of these assets. So this will be sort of a growing table. So what's available in 2022 will also be available in 2023, and then 23 and 24 and so on. So by the time we get to 2025, as you can see, we should have quite a wide range of different standards covering different assets and practices on farms, which will which will cover a wide range of farms and give us a really good opportunity to deliver environmental benefits and support farmers and their businesses over that period. So it really is if there's one thing to take back today about the sustainable farm incentive, is that it's a growing picture, and what we're starting with in 2022 is just the start, and it's going to build over the coming years. Hopefully it's useful to see this sort of thought process of where we're going over the next few years. This is our current sort of plan. Not saying it won't change, because we may have to sort of change as we learn and as things become live and we see how they work. But this is where we're currently sort of planning to go to. So if I could have the next slide, please. So just coming on from that initial discussion, why do we start with soils? So it was there are sort of any myriad of reasons why, but obviously soils are one of our most important natural assets, and from a farming perspective, they're the sort of the day one, the baseline thing that you need to make a successful farming business. So why not start with the most important natural asset? It's also one particular asset that applies to pretty much all farms in the country. Everybody's got soils of different types and use them for different purposes. And so the idea behind these standards is to improve that soil health and the structure, the organic matter and its biology, and that will in turn also will help us with our aims of promoting clean water and our biodiversity increase and climate resilience, as well as food production, and absolutely not forgetting that the important side of that, because they really do go hand in hand. Excuse me. Also, on a more practical note, sorry. On a more practical note, I'm really sorry. Just
no problem, Sam. Take a.
So yeah. So on a more practical note, the soil standards have had little involvement in existing agri-environment schemes to date. And Jonathan, would you be able to just take over for a couple of moments?
Yes, of course. Yes. So Sam says, I think the reason we picked up on so Sam picking up on soils as a real priority. I think one of the really interesting areas was a big decision that we had to make last year was how we could roll the scheme out in a way which supported and complemented countryside stewardship, because otherwise it would be the administration of running both schemes with lots of overlap was just too much. So we started to solve for lots of reasons, but one of those reasons was it really limited the overlaps from countryside stewardship, which made it much easier.
Thanks, Jonathan. So hopefully I'll be back and okay now. So yeah, and I think, as I said before, it really is just the first step of a wider rollout of the standards in the coming years. So it's important that we start with one of our most important assets and work on from there. So next slide, please. And then the additional part of our offer in 2022 will be the annual health and welfare review. So this is a slight step away from the sort of direct environmental land management work that we've been doing, but it actually is very closely linked with all the different types of activities that we're doing in the wider Future Farming and Countryside programme, and how we link those all together. So we wanted to get the sort of first step of the animal health and welfare pathway included within the offer. And so our offer for sort of 2022 will be a yearly farm visit, either from a vet or from a vet-led team, which will sort of start to build further on the existing relationships between farmers and vets. And we're very much aware that this is already an activity that's going on the majority of farming businesses, but we want to give everybody the opportunity to do that, and we want to fund that opportunity, and we want to make that part of business as usual. The idea is to have time and to consider the sort of all the issues around endemic diseases and how you can improve welfare and the opportunities there and how you can responsibly use veterinary medicines, and really just give the opportunity to strengthen those relationships, because we know we've already got really high welfare standards and we want to build on those even more. There's also some, from our perspective in Defra, there's some really good opportunity to build much more information and understanding about our national herds and our national flocks and where we are in those and how we're improving, so that we can ensure that we remain pretty much at the top of the tree of our animal health and welfare standards, worldwide. So that's part of the reason behind bringing this in in the same vein as our sustainable farming incentive, because it is something that's there for all our farmers and growers throughout England. Initially, like the general eligibility, it's going to be available to farmers who are eligible for BPS, so on the same system. And as you can see on the slide, we've got sort of an initial level of entry. So that will be 50 pigs, 20 sheep or 10 cattle. So if you've got that number or over, then you'll be eligible for the review as part of your sustainable farming incentive application. And obviously we will fund those costs for the initial years. And again, like the main eligibility, we'll be looking to widen this out in future years as the scheme becomes more established and we're able to move away from the sort of BPS eligibility as we go down through the delinking processes Jonathan outlined earlier. So that's sort of a bit of a quick run through of how we envisage the sustainable farming incentive to operate this year and what's going to be included and how it's going to work. And as I said, it's a learning process for all of us, and I'm sure that as the scheme is launched and we see how it's taken up and how it works, we'll be sort of iterating and updating and adding more things into it. But it is really quite an exciting start to be starting it earlier than we'd originally envisaged as well. So I'm sure we've got some questions that we can pick up later on, but for the moment I will hand you across to Richard, who is going to talk to you about the local nature recovery scheme and the landscape recovery scheme. So Richard, over to you.
Thanks, Sam. I've also been having a coughing fit, luckily whilst you were speaking. Hopefully I'm over it now. Thank you. Yes, also very pleased to be here and to be able to talk to you about local nature recovery. So next slide, please. So on the 6th of January, we published more details about local nature recovery and landscape recovery. And we're positioning local nature recovery as the improved and more ambitious successor to the countryside stewardship scheme in England, saying it will take the best of countryside stewardship and will add in some new elements to make a scheme that has wider appeal and can deliver more and better outcomes, but also in a less bureaucratic and more supportive way. It will pay for actions to make space for nature in the farm landscape and the wider countryside alongside food production. Next slide, please. So the local nature recovery options will initially cover the following themes of managing, feeding, shelter and breeding areas for wildlife on arable farms, managing, restoring and creating grassland habitats, wetland habitats, coastal habitats and lowland heathland, managing and restoring areas of upland and lowland peat and moorland on farms and in the wider countryside, targeted measures to support the recovery and reintroduction of particular wildlife species, such as creating and managing nesting and feeding habitat, and to tackle non-native invasive species. We also fund managing and creating trees and woodlands, but definitely note that the England Woodland Creation Offer, or UCO, will be the main scheme for woodland creation at larger scale until 2025. L&R will also fund nature-based solutions for water, such as creating and managing infield vegetation, buffer strips and swales to reduce and filter runoff and contribute to improving water quality and water availability, and of course mitigating flood risk. It'll also pay for restoring rivers, floodplains, streams and riparian habitats. So local nature recovery is looking to cover a large base, both mass market environmental delivery that goes beyond SFI, covering some land management actions that are equivalent to countryside stewardship mid-tier offers, as well as some more tailored activities on sensitive sites that are more akin to CS higher tier or higher level stewardship offers. Next slide, please. In terms of the agreements, they'll cover multiple years with the length dependent on the type of activities being undertaken. Some are inherently longer term than others. There'll be flexibility to allow people to add more options or land into their agreement over time. And we'll continue working with farming experts to make sure that the scheme is accessible to tenant farmers and those farming commons. Overall, we'll foster an approach to checking compliance that is more supportive and less punitive for minor discrepancies than previous schemes, while of course preventing fraud or other illegality and addressing more substantive failings when necessary. So we'll build on the improvements we've made in previous schemes, where we're making greater use of advisory letters and on-the-ground support, rather than automatically applying penalties where we find things that aren't quite right, but the farmer is prepared to take timely action to remedy these. And we'll test approaches that can help make our checks more efficient in this space. For example, we'll test how remote monitoring could be used as an alternative to in-person site visits. And that's building on work we've already done on this in our existing schemes. We'll also look at how earned recognition can help us target our checks. Next slide, please. In terms of, I think I might have covered the wrong one there, sorry. I'll just check where I am, my apologies. I think that's the slide I've gone through. Sorry, could I have the next slide? I might have missed one. Right, testing and rollout, yes, sorry. It's important that we test the scheme with farmers so we're confident it can work, particularly the new elements that have not been included in the previous schemes. The way we do this will be different to the SFI pilot. We have already learned a lot from our tests and trials and from existing schemes, so we don't need a full pilot over several years. We'll focus on testing things that are different in the most efficient and effective ways possible over the next year. So we envisage testing and piloting activities will be with up to 500 participants, representing a range of sectors and both those already in and those not in agri-environment schemes. But we will publish more information later this year on how we'll undertake testing and how farmers can get involved. Next slide, please. So local nature recovery strategies. So, you've probably heard about these. These are a new measure contained in the Environment Act. So that got royal assent last autumn. There was also a consultation on a consultation document that came out on the guidance. So it'd be well worth you having a look at that, because that has some you get some inferences about the scheme from that. But the idea is that it will create a new system of spatial strategies for nature covering the whole of England. Our approach to spatial prioritisation for local nature recovery, i.e. doing the best things or the right things in the right places, will be complemented by the rollout of LNRSs. And we are analysing feedback from tests and trials, the LNRS pilots, and the LNRS consultation to determine how this should work in practice. So I think that's it on local nature recovery. If you could go to the next slide, please. In terms of landscape recovery, got a bit more information on how this scheme will work. It's open to any individuals or groups who want to come together to deliver large, that's 500 to 5,000 hectare scale projects. We expect landscape recovery pilot projects alone will create at least 20,000 hectares of wilder landscapes, habitats, re-wetted peat and afforestation at a landscape scale. So we're planning to open applications for landscape recovery projects in at least 2 rounds over the next 2 years. And the first wave of projects will be focused on 2 themes: recovering and restoring England's threatened native species. And we envisage the projects under this theme will cover priority habitats, habitat quality and species abundance. The other theme is restoring inland streams and rivers, improving water quality, biodiversity and adapting to climate change. And these sort of projects could restore water bodies, rivers and floodplains to a more natural state, reduce nutrient pollution, benefit aquatic species and improve flood mitigation and resilience to climate change. So we'll assess applications for the first wave of pilot projects against set criteria focused on the project's feasibility, costs, and potential impacts. And we'll run separate competitions for projects under the species recovery and river restoration themes. So, and the sort of criteria we're talking about are ones that are include things like longevity, environmental benefits, such as species recovery or the river restoration, carbon and climate resilience, social impact, project leadership and delivery, and of course, costs. And full guidance will be found by the link on gov.uk. So, I mean, the intention is that we want everyone who has a vision for making a difference to find a place in our new schemes, and applicants for landscape recovery that aren't selected for funding will be signposted to other schemes, such as LNR, local nature recovery, which may be more appropriate for their proposal. And each round will award the most promising projects with development funding. This will support more detailed planning over around a 2-year period. Detail on what this grant can and cannot cover is set out in our full scheme guidance. During that project development phase, projects will be assessed at regular intervals so we can check if they're on track and aim to support them where needed. So if a project meets our requirements at the end of the development phase, they will be awarded a long-term implementation agreement, allowing them to start delivering on the ground. But if at the end of the development phase projects don't meet requirements for further LR funding, we'll work with them to see whether they're more appropriate mechanisms, as I mentioned earlier. And we certainly would like to see all interested projects continuing on to participate in one of the environmental land management schemes. Given the sort of inherent large scale and ambitious nature of landscape recovery projects, we anticipate they'll be well placed to secure private investment to complement Defra's funding, so that projects will not be fully funded by Defra alone beyond the development phase. The project implementation phase is when work on the ground will commence, and our aim obviously is that many go from project development to project implementation. And the implementation agreements will be long-term, such as 20 years plus, and the projects will have long-term safeguards in place to protect them into the future, such as possibly conservation covenants. But unlike SFI or LNR, won't be setting out a list of activities we'll pay for and associated payment rates. Rather, we'll work with projects to negotiate bespoke agreements, and they will then need to deliver according to those. So if you could have the next slide, please. And I think so in terms of next steps for landscape recovery, we have actually launched the application process. We released the invitation to apply and published full guidance on the scheme. So projects can now apply for the first round between 1st of February and 24th of May 2022. And we will, as it says there, confirm the chosen first round pilot project by early July 2022. So it's quite exciting times for the landscape recovery. So next slide, please. So I think I'm handing back to Jonathan at this stage to take us through the last couple of slides.
Yeah, it's just a bit of some signposting for colleagues. As we talk a lot about kind of co-design and working with farmers, so there are lots of opportunities out there, and we'll work very, very closely with the CLA, Susan, Catherine, and the team. So there's opportunities here. And what I would say is I've been answering some questions in the chat. A lot of those questions that we're able to answer because of our blog. So I would really recommend everyone signing up to the Defra e-alert and our blog. So for example, you'd have seen today that we have set out the rules for the lump sum exit scheme. We provide regular blogs, talking to farmers, and setting out the scheme rules. It's a really great resource. And if you're interested in the program, which I can see many of you are, that's the place to be to understand what's going on and how you can get stuck in. Next question. Next slide, please, Tina. Yes, and here's a few links, which perhaps we're very happy to share the slides. That said, it's all set out on the blog, but here's more information you want to get back under the skin, particularly for Sustainable Farming Incentive, which is quite close to being launched. Get back under the skin of that scheme and look at the rules in more detail. Then that's the links here and the Future Farming and Countryside Programme blog and the place to look at. So back to you, Captain team.
Great, thanks all. If everyone could switch on their cameras again, and we will stop sharing the slides. Jonathan has answered a number of questions that were asked already, but just in case you haven't seen those, Jonathan just mentioned the publication of the lump sum exit scheme today. And Simon Fisher had asked about a date for the launch of the scheme, and Jonathan said that that would be April. There's a number of questions here about the allocation of funds. So Jonathan, I think that's probably best for you. There's a question about how we will ensure that all farmers are equally able to access full income opportunities by all three tiers. How do you justify such a high percentage of the total budget going to landscape recovery? And also, how will you ensure tenants on shorter term arrangements are able to have equal opportunities to access funds across all three tiers?
Yeah, great. So yeah, it's a really important question. So we announced in June that we would look to have an even split across the schemes by 2028. So that was an important part of setting out kind of our intent and showing the kind of level of ambition that the program's looking to achieve. That was also that at the time was our best assessment about what mix of schemes we needed to meet the targets that the program is here to deliver, especially around subsidy-free farming, but also around natural environment and improving net zero. So it was always indicative and always subject to change. We're not going to announce here any change to those numbers, but what we are saying is that we're continually reviewing them over time, so that the split of schemes is right. The point about fairness, I think, in a program and a scheme which is kind of increasingly focused on outcomes, there will be a different set of opportunities available to different sorts of farmers and land managers. It's really important to us that the way we're designing our schemes, including SFI and LNR and LR, is that they are particularly a sustainable farming incentive is sort of near universal, and everyone can do something which works really well for them. But there will be some farmers who either want to, or suits their business model better. They're either willing to make those changes, or for whatever reasons, to engage perhaps in all three schemes. And the Secretary of State set out at the CLA speech, for some farmers it might be that they stay away and kind of focus on subsidy-free farming, and others look to use our schemes to complement their own business. So we are expecting a bit of different farmers to approach it in different ways, in a way which best suits their business model and the opportunities that they have. On tenants, where it's not that straightforward, I appreciate, because of potential restrictions, certainly around long-term land use change and longer-term agreements. There's loads of stuff which I think I'm really proud of around sustainable farming incentive to make sure that scheme works for farmers. So talking a 3-year agreement, which works, we were told worked really well for tenant farmers. And Sam could touch on some of the other points perhaps. The way we've designed that, then the scope of the scheme, so you don't need to get landlord permission. So there's a lot of the flexibility for farmers who have the management control to do what they need to do. And the onus on the tenant to say, yes, I have the ability to make these changes, therefore I don't need to get the landlord's permission, so it works for those tenant farmers. We are now applying the same sort of like tenant-focused thinking and also commoner-focused thinking to local nature recovery and landscape thinking as we move to that next level of detail. And to help us do that, Secretary of State has asked Baroness Kate Rock to lead an independent review of tenancies to make sure that tenant farmers and tenancies are kind of work best, are able to support farmers as they apply for our schemes. That will have representatives on that group from tenants, but also from the landowning representatives. And then, yeah, in terms of, and there was a couple of things in there about the 3% statistic. So the idea being, we said that we want to put an even proportion of spend across all of those three schemes, but the idea that only landscape recovery will only be applied on like 3% of the land. So that's not quite right. We don't know exactly what quantum. We haven't actually designed the scheme yet. We won't until 2024. We don't quite know what extent the scheme will cover. So we're working through that over time. The 3% figure only relates to the sort of initial range of schemes that we're delivering over time. And the expectation is that landscape recovery, as Richard touched on, will be available and something which farmers can benefit from, perhaps working with other farmers. And we're really keen to see those sort of like farm cluster ideas come forward.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. There's some questions here about when the SFI is likely to be available in 2022, because at the moment it's saying later this year. Any ideas there?
Yep. Did you want me to take that one, Jonathan?
Yes, please.
Yeah. So so we haven't completely finalised when we will be opening the application window for applications this year. But we are working on the intention that we want to make payments for this scheme this year. So and we've said in our December publication that payments will be 3 months, will be paid on a 3-month basis in arrears. And we also want a 10-week application window to give people sort of sufficient time to consider applications and consider what land or what standards they want to enter, and that we don't want to sort of confuse it with other sort of pinch points of the year. So, for example, the BPS application date. So hopefully that sort of gives you more of an idea of the sort of timelines that we're working to, but we can't give you a precise date yet because we haven't sort of finalised that. But if you look at those sort of different factors that we're all working within, that should give you an idea of when we're hoping to get towards opening the application window.
And just to pick up on Sam's point there, so that might sort of sound like Defra doesn't know when it's going to launch its scheme, but I think what we do, one of the things that we've learned from, we spend a lot of time thinking about what we've done before and kind of how we can do things better. One of the things that we've learned from the programme today, but also from previous CAP reforms, was setting a hard date and then driving towards it and delivering something which just didn't work very well. So we're looking to be much more, sort of learn that lesson really clearly. So Sam said we're going to make the first payments before the end of the year, and in the way that and avoid the windows around around basic payment scheme. But the reason we're not setting to a hard deadline for the opening the scheme is because if we do that, we've seen it too often drive kind of poor performance and poor design because you have to cut corners to try to hit that deadline. So that might feel a bit uncomfortable. It's a bit uncomfortable for us, a bit uncomfortable for farmers, but it's definitely the right thing to do because we need to kind of make sure that we're delivering a solution and a service which really works for farmers. Just to pick up on Sam's threads there.
I think that there's been some concern amongst the questions about BPS dropping very rapidly and obviously by 2024 by 50% and making up that income. So Alan Francis and a few others have asked about the payment rates for SFI. So Alan said, how have you worked out the payment rates for SFI, cost plus margin basis, or what Defra can afford? I'm concerned that the cost of compliance and that the fact that the current countryside stewardship payments don't cover the costs. Obviously, the countryside stewardship rates have been reviewed. And someone else saying that the payment rates offered within the pilot haven't been worthwhile. Will this be increased to a more realistic level? Sam,
yes, so perhaps Sam can pick up. So on payments though, yeah, it's we said in June last year that it would be a kind of cost-based model. We looked at other alternatives such as kind of payment by results, but we decided the kind of cost-based model was the best way of setting rates in those schemes. We worked really hard. We published some indicative rates in June around SFI, which we then worked with people to understand what they look like and whether or not how those rates would work. We then changed them quite significantly again in December, and those rates have now been set. But we know, so as we've said before, we kind of keep those under review. If we see the level of uptake we think we need to hit our targets, then that's great. And if not, then we'll kind of feel the need to adapt and refresh those payment rates over time. But our sense at the moment is that those rates will get people involved in the scheme, especially now that we've increased countryside stewardship payment rates to work alongside them. Sam, is that about right, Sam? Or is there anything else?
Yeah, no, I think so. Just to pick up on the pilot point as well, that we're looking at the pilot rates because obviously they were published before we'd been doing our sort of work because that was sort of an earlier start. So we're looking at those as well in light of the sort of changes that we've done to the SFI 22 rates and the review of the countryside stewardship. So they're all being looked at, but but we've been doing a lot of work with our sort of stakeholders and contractors and specialists to sort of look at these rates and try and get them using the framework behind that, but try and get them as right as we can to start the scheme.
Sam, Jane has said, where are the lessons learned from the pilot and how will that be incorporated into the standards in SFI 2022? Presumably that is one of the points, that if realised that the rates were not high enough, then that would potentially mean that they would be reviewed.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And actually, that's a really good question to pose, because we've got lots of different threads going on. So we've got this early rollout scheme, we've got the pilot running, we're doing lots of engagement with stakeholders, both organisations, so people like yourselves, the CLA, but also right down to sort of farmers as well, working on all of these individual things. And it's all sort of going into this big pot of learning and iterating the scheme. So as the pilot we've got our 930 odd pilot participants sort of commencing work and actions now. We're getting to see some of that stuff coming out. When we launch the scheme later this year, we're going to have at scale, but with a restricted number of standards running. So we'll get to learn how those things work, and the payment rates will be part of that as well.
Okay, another one for Sam. Sam, with organic not coming in until 2025 for SFI, will the mid-tier in countryside stewardship still be an option in 2024 for converting parcels?
Yep. So again, another good question. So yes. So essentially, our offer for organics will, for support through countryside stewardship and the conversion, will continue along the lines of how countryside stewardship will continue in the transition period. So the last new applications or agreements in countryside stewardship will be in 2024, and therefore there'll be potentially 5-year agreements from that date. Just for people thought process and planning, applications will need to be made in 2023 for 2024 from in terms of thinking that. But yes, while we're bringing the sustainable farming incentive and the other schemes online, countryside stewardship is definitely still a really important area for people to focus on. And we've seen that this year, because I think we've had a 40% uplift in applications this year on last year. So people are moving towards that mindset as well in this transition period as we develop the schemes and roll them out. So definitely still there.
Richard, a question for you. There's a question about if you could explain further the rivers, streams, etc. on landscape recovery. So I guess it's asking for a bit more detail than just the titles you've got there. And if that isn't available, when it might be.
At the moment, there's not full details of exactly what the type of thing is that we'll fund. That's just the headline for what will be funded. This is for landscape recovery, I'm assuming.
Local nature recovery, I think.
Oh, right, yes. Well, for local nature recovery, there's quite a there's a long list of things under that bucket, as it were, of activities. So we're saying that of all the things, though, you could create and manage infield vegetation, look at buffer strips and swales to reduce and filter runoff. So you're looking at things that both improve water quality and also retain water or moderate the flow of water. So these actions can have co-benefits of mitigating flood risk as well as increasing the water quality in stream, also stopping things like erosion of the banks, especially of small streams and rivers. So it's those sort of things. But it's also innovative ideas for restoring rivers, floodplains, streams and riparian habitats. There could be a range of things to do that, whether it's reinforcing the banks, willow spiling. Again, I'm not saying these are particular ones, but it would be those sort of activities that land managers could do that we'd be looking for. I mean, that's the intention, is to be able to cover a suite of actions in LNR. For landscape recovery, it is looking bigger, and that's one of the things that landscape recovery could look at is several landowners across or down a river actually working together to improve and restore that particular river catchment.
Richard, there's some questions on when we will expect the financials on local nature recovery, given that we are still talking quite high level now. So when do you think we might get some figures there?
I understand we'll be publishing more on scheme details, and I would hope that would include payment rates later this year.
Okay.
That's my understanding.
Yeah.
A question about IT systems. Jonathan, is that one for you? Will the IT systems be able to cope with the two systems? So, there's a lot of schemes out there at the moment. We've got basic payment being phased out, and we've got ELMS coming in, but also all of the other schemes in train as well.
Yeah, so it's a good. It's obviously one of the really fundamental and really important questions, and we know that it's always harder than we think it is. And we did a big review after the last cap reform and the changes that we made, because you may recall it was the last round we brought out countryside stewardship and basic payment scheme was quite a challenge. So we're not at all naive about it. We've made some examples to show the way that we're thinking about this, or the way in which making sure that the IT works is informing scheme design, is the way we design countryside stewardship and sustainable farming incentive to work alongside each other to avoid the overlap. One thing that would have been really difficult and kind of too expensive to do this year will be for SFI to really kind of overlap with countryside stewardship options, so that when and that's part of the reason why we had to exclude element fields in which had countryside stewardship in it from the SFI pilot, because maybe we could have done it, but it would have quite likely have made the IT work. So when there's really obvious or high risks, we're changing the policy to fit around the IT that we have in the short term. Another example is using BPS recipients to get them to limit eligibility for the initial rollout of sustainable farming incentives. So that just allows us to use the same IT systems in a way which is a bit easier. Then from 2023 and 24, we've got some fantastic people designing the service which we will use, including the team who led the DVLA, if you've updated your driving license recently, and how smooth that sort of process is. We've got a really good team from across government who are now designing the services so that we can move off those legacy systems and onto our newer systems as we start to roll out those schemes. So the answer is, obviously, we hope that it will. We've talked a lot about how we can make it work, and as I've touched on already, we're making decisions which recognise that we need to make sure that IT works, rather than getting overexcited by really nice policy ideas which end up then kind of falling over.
Okay, Sam, a few questions on the animal health review. First of all, I think that you've answered a question on the system, but I think it's useful for everyone to hear where they can find the rates for the annual health and welfare review, and also a question around whether we have enough vets to put the review in place, because they said that their vet has given up farm animal veterinary.
Yeah, thank you. So I did answer that question so people can see. And we published our sort of proposed rates for the review in our publication in December. And I think we've got some links. I might be able to put that in the chat as well, which people can see to have a look at that.
Sam, if you can put it in the chat rather than answering the questions, because I'm conscious that some people don't look at the questions that are answered on the Q&A bar. So if you put it in the chat to everyone instead. Thanks.
Yeah, no, definitely. And so, I mean, and we've been working, the initial sort of review, which will be sort of looking at practices, what you do with the records that you keep, the types of, diseases and things that you're looking out for and managing on your farms already is sort of that will be the initial process. So it's not always sort of particularly, dependent upon the numbers, other than our sort of baseline thresholds for being eligible. And the rates that we've got for the review, I think it's pigs are £684 annually, sheep 436, beef cattle 522, and dairy 372. So those are our current rates, and we've been working with various sort of industry experts and different people to refine those rates, obviously before we set them and then subsequently publish them. So those are the sorts of figures.
There's a question here just on the payment. Where Sophie said the payments on the page you've given above, are they per review, irrespective of how many animals there are on the farm?
Yes, so they are. It's per review because the initial discussion, the initial sort of point of the review will be there to sort of discuss about sort of animal health and welfare of animals, and the sort of biosecurity you have on farm, and the sort of actions that you may need to think about taking to improve or to help that, and then looking at sort of different tests and discussions around sort of usage of existing usage of vet meds or approach to that, and all of those sort of things. And it's really it's that initial sort of stage of sort of building that relationship and that understanding, and doing that on a sort of a level for every, or giving every farmer in England, or every sort of livestock farm in England, the opportunity to do that. So it's not really sort of numbers specific in that way, although obviously the sort of larger the holding, the sort of more potentially complex, or with mixed livestock, complex those discussions might be. But that's the idea between that, so it won't be sort of numbers based initially.
And the point on the availability of vets? And the
availability of vets, well, we've been working with our vets, and we've got a number of sort of vets and links through the industry. And as I said, when we were going through the slides, the vast majority of our farmers are already doing this and already have their, regular contact and a good relationship with our vets. And it's just sort of trying to sort of normalize that and set that. So we're pretty confident that we do have, sufficient capacity for that, within England to undertake it.
Okay. There's a question probably again for you, Sam, about heritage and walls standard, concern that the fact that this is left until 2025, given there's such a huge asset to upland farms, which potentially provides income and benefit to upland farmers who are losing, obviously, BPS and quite reliant on that.
Yep. No. So good points. So obviously we have there is provision for sort of heritage and access and other things through existing schemes. So through existing countryside stewardship schemes and higher level schemes, and those will continue throughout the transition. So we will still be supporting those throughout the transition while we're bringing out the schemes. And as I mentioned, sort of in the roadmap, it's a building picture, but we want to make sure that when we do launch standards into the scheme, that they're deliverable, that they work, that we've tested them, that we've built them properly, that where we can, that we've piloted them all. So although it feels like it's sort of a long way in the future, in actual fact, if we're doing all of that work beforehand, so we've said that indicatively we would be looking to have a heritage and a dry stone wool standard in the offer in 2025. Before we actually do that, we've got quite a bit of work to do to make sure it's right, to make sure it works, to make sure it's tested, and we'll be doing that sort of between now and then, and bring them. But as I say, whilst we still have existing schemes, throughout the transition, still sort of supporting those sort of areas.
There's obviously been lots of questions about the payments, and there's a question of how often you will be reviewing the payment rate. Do you know how often that is likely to be? Because someone said here, with the current published payment rates, that I in SFI more likely to refer to initiative rather than incentive. How often will you be reviewing payment rates to incentivize farmers properly to enter this scheme, rather than just paying what they've been already doing?
Yeah, so that's a good point. There's a lot of discussion about payments, and I'm aware on Twitter, and also for our co-design panel back through the pilot. So we get, we get a range of views about the level of payments. Some of the farmers we're talking to, seeing how they work in their farm business, and that they're looking forward to engaging pretty comprehensively across their farm with SFI in particular. We see we've used a similar-ish methodology. We've tweaked it a little bit. We see some methodology in countryside stewardship, and we see really high uptake even before we increase the payment rates of that scheme, around 40%. So, and our assessment of the kind of economic evidence is such that those payments, particularly SFI, are going to work, which is why this is the second time we've had two bites of the cherry, and this is where we've ended up having published the initial interim rates we then reviewed. So that's just to give a sense about why we have those rates as we do. In terms of a review, so one of the kind of beauties of SFIs is quite a flexible scheme. So so not private furnishing. It's quite a flexible scheme, so we can continue to refresh it and adapt the scheme over time. We've seen with countryside stewardship that we can review payment rates where it works, where it's the right thing to do. I think what we will be doing at SFI is seeing the level of uptake, how farmers engage, which standards they engage over which area, and we will then use that to inform whether or not we need to be looking again at those, rates. We always see quite a kind of slow uptake of schemes initially. We've seen that on everything we've ever done of our agri-environmental schemes. So we're expecting to see a similar sort of pattern across this year. So the short answer is we'll kind of wait and see. We're not going to commit to a regular review of payments. We've thought about it, but the challenge of doing that is that people, especially in a rising market like now, will just stop their activity and wait for the review to be complete. So what we want people to be doing is, if this works for you, if it works on your farm, then it's the right thing for you, which is a message we've been saying, lots of advisors have been saying on countryside stewardship. If this works for you and your business, then let's kind of, then go for it. And that's the message we're going to be giving to SFI.
Yeah, as we can see by the questions, there's a lot of concern in the industry. A lot of people are losing money. So everyone does need to think about what they're doing and not sit and wait, given that incomes are going down very rapidly. There's a question around encouragement for vegetable and root growers, and saying that there seems to be little encouragement for those growers yet, especially those crops requiring winter weathered land, frost mold. Sam, Richard, is there anything that you can say that might be available in either SFI or local nature recovery in the not too distant future that they can be looking at?
Yep, I'm very happy to start that off. And Richard, do come in if there's anything further to add. So we are talking to quite a lot of stakeholders in that sort of area, and we are, we do have a sort of a specialist horticulture standard lined up for the future. I think at the moment we're looking to see what we want to do is, as we roll out the standards, and looking at the soil standards, for example, in terms of green cover and improving organic matter, and sort of nutrient management and integrated pest management are sort of ones that are in the near future. Those, we think that will all work quite well in the horticultural sector. But we know that, obviously that there's such a wide range of different farming practices that we want the SFI scheme to be able to encompass, and on a simple basis, as I said before, with, empowering farmers to be able to do it themselves and to be able to, apply and undertake the actions. So what we're looking to do is to work with those to make sure that, all the different actions within the standards that we're bringing out, have relevance to the different farming sectors, and then where we feel that there is still opportunities to give rise to even more environmental benefits, then we'll include those. And so, for example, in a specialist sort of horticultural standard, and a bit like as we discussed earlier with the organics as well, we're looking at an organic standard, or focusing existing actions into an organic standard as the scheme sort of develops.
Also, just if I may, I was going to say we've got a number of grant offers which we're expanding, which will be available to a kind of broader range of farmers. So we expanded our eligibility for contractors, but also horticulture has always been eligible for lots of our grant offers. So I think we've got an offer live now or shortly around kind of automation in particular, another one coming up, a grant offer around added value. And then at the end of last year, we opened and have now closed kind of farming equipment and transformation fund, which also covered off those sectors as well. So we're very aware of it. And Sam and the team and others in SFI will have particular discussions with horticulture team. We have our own Defra horticulture team, so we're very aware of that. And actually, we're aware that particularly around the SFI being focused on BPS initially, that's kind of suboptimal for some of those farmers, and we're very aware that we need to try to address that in future. As I said, we did that so we could deliver the scheme, but it's we'll continue to review so that the schemes are as eligible to as many farmers as possible.
I know that some of the farmers that are on the call today will could have potentially applied for the transformation fund with the water. theme, but I think that there was some concern over the timing of that and the notice, and I know that we've already fed that back and you've taken on board that we need more time before something is launched like that, so that we know what the theme is, and then sufficient time for big themes. You know, if it's a big water reservoir that's going to take hundreds of thousands of pounds, it takes a long time to plan that. So a few months isn't sufficient, and I think that water being included in additional rounds would be really helpful for a lot of people on the call.
Yeah, definitely. I think we've heard that really clearly from yourself and from others, especially in the East, and where that's an issue for you guys. I think it's suboptimal. It's always harder to get things out of government than there is any reason to think about it, especially when you're spending quite large amounts of money. So it certainly wasn't the intent to leave that shorter window, but as you say, we've heard that message pretty loudly about how we can and actually I talked on a farm on Friday talking about how we can get the balance right between people understanding what's coming so they can prepare for it without suddenly the whole sector freezing until our next grant offer is available. So it's a difficult one to get the balance right, but I don't think we got that right initially, especially around Christmas and such a busy time.
I know that the intention is that there's improvements in terms of penalties and working with the RPA on those inspections. There's a question about what will happen to cross-compliance rules when BPS ends. And also, Andrew Ward has said about farms pulling out of stewardship, one who'd spent 130,000 on land agent fees fighting the RPA incorrectly withholding payments. You briefly touched on this in your presentation. I mean, how can you give confidence that we will have proportionate penalties going forward, and confidence for farmers to go into these schemes that they won't be penalised?
Yeah, so I was just smiling at Jean-Charles' this comment, but so on cross-compliance, I'll ask a question about what's going to happen to cross-compliance, because that gives us a sense of what will happen next. So in 2024, we'll delink direct payments, and we'll stop, by which we mean that you'll continue to be able to claim the direct payments if you have an entitlement over a certain reference period, but that you won't need to continue to link it back to the land. So at that point, obviously, cross-compliance ceases to have effect. That will stop happening. So that'll be in 2024. And that's a really big simplification. That's a really big administrative improvement from our side, because we're moving away a big kind of process. At a time when the math-based payment schemes will have round halved. So instead of what we replace it, so we already have the legal baseline exists. So cross-compliance was an enforcement system. We have a set of legal requirements, which many of the farmers on the call will know about, around animal health and welfare, and of course around kind of environmental impact and so on and so forth, and pollution. So they will continue to exist, and we will enforce those through a mixture of the Rural Payments Agency, Environment Agency, and others. There are a couple of things we need to do to make that system work better, to get better join up across all other agencies, which we're already working very much to do across the Environment Agency, Natural England, the Rural Payments Agency, but also local authorities who often inspect for animal health and welfare, so we need to improve that. And then the way that we inspect needs to be much more improved. So we've already talked about it's a small thing but makes a difference. Rather than being inspections, and I've talked about being outcome visits or outcome visits. And we're giving a lot more agency to the inspectors and the staff to come along and provide some discretion, have a lot more discretion about what is significant, what's not significant, and for small infringements to identify opportunities for improvement, and to come back. And if something's happening multiple times, or it's happening in a way which is clearly negligent or willfully harmful, then they can throw the book, so to speak. But for those small things, be much more proportionate about what we do. So there will always be some instances where there is still a need to be, kind of very robust about those, and that won't change at all.
Thanks, Jonathan. We are going to have to finish in a minute. I do just want to mention Andrew Ward's point, where he's mentioning farming rules for water. So obviously, the policies through ELMS, Defra policies are to support organic matter and soil health, but obviously that conflicts with EA policies on farming rules for water. CLA, NFU, lots of other organisations have been working to try and make sure that farming rules for water are fit for purpose and consider different situations. I guess that it probably a plea, without going into detail, to make sure that there is, you said working with other organisations, working with the EA on there to say how important that is.
Yeah, no, definitely. That's a point well made, and Andrew has made it to me myself when I was out on the farm. I think the day after we made that with NFU colleagues out in the East, so we're very aware of the issues, which I won't necessarily repeat. But yeah, we're working closely with our RNC, and the ministers are very excited on and involved in those sorts of conversations to try to make sure we're joining things up.
Thank you all for your time. Thank you everyone for all of your questions. I'm sorry that I haven't got through all of them.